first step to making an isolation chamber is to cut the pieces of vinyl that you need to make the 3 panels. So I've prepared a piece of vinyl by measuring and drawing out the geometries of the 3 panels. And so you have the main panel, which is 72 inches long by 30 inches wide. And then you have 2 side panels, which are 27 inches long by 24 inches wide, and they have a truncated corner. And you make the truncated corner by leaving 18 inches of vinyl on a long side and 12 inches of vinyl on a short side. And when you connect those and cut the corner, then you are left with a 15-inch edge. Now that we've cut the panels of the isolation chamber, the next step is to mark the faces of the main panel. So the first face has a width of 18 inches, the second face has a width of 15 inches, the third face has a width of 12 inches, and then the last face has the leftover 27 inches. So we're making these lines because later we're going to glue frame elements along each of them, and we're also going to use them as a guide for cutting the notches that will be required to fold the device. Now that we have marked out the crease lines on the main panel, I've used them to measure out the notches that we're going to cut to enable the panel to fold. The notches are symmetrical. Each of the notches has different dimensions, so I'm going to step through one by one and show you how to measure out each one. It's important to note that the measurements on these first 2 are not exact, but they're easy to measure and they're just over the exact dimension, because if you go just under the exact dimension, then the edges will overlap when it's time to fold the device, and that makes it hard to put together. So to start, this first notch is at the edge of the 18-inch face. All of the notches are 2-inch tall triangles, and on this first notch, each base point of the triangle is 1 inch away from the center line. On the next notch, which is at the other side of the 15-inch face, it's again a 2-inch tall triangle, and each base point is 13/16 of an inch away from the center line. On the last one, which is on the far side of the 12-inch face, it's again 2 inches tall, and each base point is 2 inches away from the center line. Now it's time to cut the notches. We're going to use a 1/4-inch hole punch to cut out the tip of the notch and then cut the edges with scissors. This is the final cutting guide for the main panel of the device. Here you can see a close-up of the markings for the elliptical hand entry ports. We've arranged these to be as close to the framing of the device as possible, so that puts the center point of each port 6.5 inches away from this crease line. And then the center point for the ports are 11.5 inches apart. Here you can see the back face of our device where we've drawn guides for cutting slits to allow entry of the patient's torso. Our center slit starts 15 inches from the bottom of the device, and then the other slits taper down from there.
The next step of the process is to adhere the frame to the vinyl panels. So these are the fiberglass cross braces. These are 25.5 inches long. These will be thermoformed into pockets of vinyl, which will then be glued to the main panel. These are the fiberglass components of the main frame. These will all be put into one single clear vinyl tube, which will then be adhered to the main vinyl sheet. This is 17.5 inches long. This is 14.5 inches long. This is 11.5 inches long, and this is 26.5 inches long, and then it's symmetrical on the other side. The fiberglass rods for the cross braces and for the main frame are all a 1/4 inch in diameter. I have here a piece of clear vinyl tube. This is 5/16 inch inner diameter and 7/16 inch outer diameter. I'm now going to slide these main components into the tube in order. So I'll start with the longest piece here. So here we have all the component tube rods slid into the clear vinyl tube. You can see that the joints actually have a 1/2 inch gap, and these are centered on the crease lines in the main panel. You can see that the vinyl tube is actually 1 inch longer than the main panel, so the tube is actually 74 inches in length. I'm now going to snip the tube 3/4 of an inch from the end of the fiberglass rod. I will now use a heat gun set to 640 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'm going to heat the end of the tube until I see it warp. And then I'm going to use these pair of pliers to clamp down on the edge and seal it. So I'm going to push the rod until it meets the end here. So you want to do this before doing the other end to make sure that the tube matches with the end of the panel. The rods inside the tube actually have to be readjusted again, so make sure you put them back in their original location before heat welding the other end. Now, after rearranging the rods inside the tube, you can see that the tube now juts out of the main panel by like 1/2 inch. You want to cut the tube right at the edge of the panel so that the heat weld actually butts up against the rod. Now we're going to heat weld this end just like we did the other end.
Okay, so for the cross braces, we aren't going to put these in vinyl tubes. We could, that is an alternative way to make this. However, we have been thermoforming vinyl pockets. This is a little bit stronger because you have a larger surface area to bond as opposed to just the bottom edge of a tube. But this is a little bit more time consuming to do it this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fiberglass cross braces. These are 25.5 inches long, and we're going to use some double-sided tape to stick them down. So we're going to roll the fiberglass onto the double-sided tape. And now we're going to stick this down onto the vinyl, making sure that we have a margin around the edges. Just about like that. So it should stick really, really well and be nice and firm on there. Now when I'm making these, I usually do all 3 of these at once. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to just do one. But ordinarily I would stick all 3 of these down, adhere them, and then we're going to thermoform them, which I'll show you next. And like I said, this time I'm just going to do this first one for the sake of brevity. Okay. So the way this works is we're going to flip this upside down, we're going to heat this vinyl, and then we're going to use these aluminum extrusions on the edge to stretch the vinyl around the shape of the tube. Now, this is kind of a time-consuming process. It's not very quick, but it produces pretty nice results that are very easy to adhere to the final product. So once again, we're going to use our heat gun. This is actually a plastic welding gun from McMaster Carr, and it is set to 640 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the temperature is important, and it may vary a little bit between different stocks of vinyl, but it's important to be able to melt the vinyl or get close to melting the vinyl without burning it. So usually the way I start this is on one end, and I'll start slowly heating the vinyl, and I'll press down on these aluminum extrusions, and eventually I have some weights over to the side here that I'll place on here to kind of help stretch it. So now I'm going to place this right up to the edges, kind of stretch that vinyl, let it set for a second. So we're letting it cool to kind of hold in place that shape we just gave it. Now if we take a look, we'll see that we already have a pretty good pocket right here on our vinyl. And so this is kind of a permanent shape now in the face of the vinyl. And we'll just keep doing that, moving down the length of the rod. Okay, so now that we've gone along the whole length and the vinyl is nice and soft along the whole length of the tube, we can start to really stick these together. And we can also put a weight on either end so that we can hold this in place while we do our kind of final pass at forming this vinyl. So now the aluminum has gotten a little bit warm, so I'm going to let it set for just a few seconds to hopefully let that vinyl cool so that that form that we've just pressed into it will set a little bit. Okay, so you can see we actually have a really nice pocket formed into that vinyl. So you see the edges lay flat and the fiberglass rod is inside of this little tunnel that we've formed into the vinyl. Now the only thing we need to do is flatten these edges, and then we can trim the piece out and glue it onto our main panel. Okay, so I'm going to flatten out these ends. So I'm just going to heat them until they start to flow a little bit, and then I'm going to use this aluminum extrusion to flatten them out. Okay, so we have a very nice thermoformed piece of vinyl. All the ends are mostly flat. There's a little bit of bend in them, but that'll be fine. That'll glue right down when we glue this to the final vinyl. Now I'm going to trim a little bit off. I don't need this much margin around here to glue down, so we're going to leave maybe about 3/4 of an inch or maybe as little as 1/2 an inch on the edge here. And that's it. We have a beautifully thermoformed piece of vinyl. Here you can see I've laid out the fiberglass cross braces in their thermoformed pockets on the vinyl where I will glue them later. Here you can see a close-up view of the way I'm laying out these fiberglass rods on the vinyl. Notice that there's a slight gap between this dashed line right here, which is the crease line, and the end of the fiberglass rod. So remember, the width between these crease lines is 26 inches. However, the length of the fiberglass rod is 25.5 inches. So there should be a 1/4 of an inch gap between the end of this and the dashed crease line. The fiberglass rod should align exactly over the crease line that corresponds with the rod. So next we're actually going to glue the pocket to the main panel of vinyl. So the glue that we use is this HH66 vinyl cement. We've been purchasing this from Amazon. I haven't found any local hardware stores that carry this, but it's fairly available on Amazon. Now the can does have an integrated brush. However, I've found that it's very difficult to precisely and quickly apply the cement using the brush. So I prefer to use a syringe. So this is just a standard 5 milliliter syringe with a luer lock fitting, and we have a dispensing needle here. So this dispensing needle is not sharp, but it's just a somewhat large diameter needle that we can use to dispense the glue. So if I load my syringe up, and we're ready to go. And it's actually quite nice. You can store the glue for several days like this. The tip of the needle will clog a little bit, but generally you can pull that glue right out. Now we're going to glue the vinyl pocket onto the main vinyl panel. So we're probably going to use basically this entire syringe between the two sides of this pocket, which is, again, a 5 milliliter syringe. We're going to run a nice thick bead of glue kind of all the way down this edge. Make sure it's positioned right where we want it. And then we're going to clamp down with this aluminum extrusion to make sure that it's all pressed nice and firmly into the vinyl. We want to make sure those vinyl surfaces are in contact, good contact for several minutes so that they bond nice and strongly. Okay, now I've pulled off the clamp holding down this side of the extrusion, or this side of the vinyl pocket. Ordinarily, I would leave this clamped while I glue the next side, but I want you guys to be able to see what's happening a little bit better. So once again, we're going to lay a nice thick bead of glue all the way down the edge. You can see we have just a little bit of glue left. And now once again, we're going to clamp this down with our aluminum extrusion. We'll do both sides this time. Put some weights on the ends. Make sure that we're right up against those edges. And then let this set for 10 or 15 minutes is usually enough to make sure that it's bonded enough to handle. Okay, so the last thing I need to do to finish this process here is add just a little bit of extra glue to the end. Typically when you're gluing along the edges, it's very easy to not get the glue to go to the very edge. So I'm just going to add a little bit of glue to the end here. Make sure these little end flaps are thoroughly adhered. And then while that starts to set, I'm also going to snip out this corner so that we can get our notch in the vinyl. Okay, the next step is to glue the main frame elements down onto the main panel of vinyl. You can see that I've lined them roughly up where they'll go. So here you can see a close-up view of one of these joints. So remember that each of these rods is ½ inch shorter than the length. So in between any two of these, there should be approximately a ½ inch gap. So you can see here that I have this lined up so that that gap occurs right where the cross brace intersects. Additionally, remember that the cross brace should have a ½ inch gap here. So it should be just enough that the tubing should rest on the thermoformed pocket. It shouldn't rest on the actual pouch with the fiberglass rod inside of it. So underneath here you can see our line that we've drawn to illustrate where this should go, and you can see that we're placing that exactly on top. Now once we have it in position, I'll put a weight on this side. That way I can keep that in place while I glue the other side. Okay, so now we're ready to glue we're going to make sure, again, that our rod is lined up just right on the vinyl, and that we are maintaining the correct gap. And then this will be really simple. We're just going to place a nice bead of glue along our dashed line. And then we're going to stick it down. And then we're going to place some weights on top of this to make sure that the vinyl bonds really well. Now we're ready to join the second rod on here. Again, check the gap before you glue, and just place a nice bead of glue along the dashed line. And then press it down, place a weight to get it to bond. Two. We're going to do the third now. Now this one's shifted a little bit, so I'm going to reorient the rod just to where it needs to be. And then, again, a nice bead of glue right down our line. Press it into place and place the weight. Now we're ready for the last section of the main frame. Sometimes we may have gotten our tubing a little bit too short, and you may have to stretch it just a little bit. In this case, our lengths are just right. But remember, in the end, you want to maintain this gap here, and you want to make sure that the tubing comes right to the end of the vinyl here. So again, we're going to put down our bead of glue. And we're going to press this into place and clamp it down with a weight. You can see that I've used 3 milliliters of glue for this. So in total, we're at about 18 milliliters between the 3 cross braces and the main frame. And then once we do the other side of the main frame, we'll be a little bit over 20 milliliters of glue. Now we have the last 2 pieces that we need to glue to the main panel for it to be completed. So the first of those is the rear arch. So we have a 60-inch length of this encapsulated rod, but this is not 1/4 inch diameter. This is 3/16, so it's slightly smaller diameter, so that we can bend it to this shape. To get this to fit properly, we actually leave 4 inches between the bottom of the fiberglass and the bottom of the device. And you'll see when you set it in this way that the end of the arch sticks up just a little bit beyond the fiberglass cross beam. So when we glue it, we're going to push it down just like this and hold it in place. So this ensures that there's always a little bit of compression pushing up on the back of the device. Just like, because of the arch shape, we're going to have some spring force straightening out and keeping this face nice and flat. Now, gluing this is a very simple exercise. We just take our syringe of glue. I like to just place a little bit under this edge. So, like I said, this arch is compressed right now, and it's only being held in place because the vinyl sticks to itself just a little bit. But we're going to glue it on both edges like this, which will give us a really strong bond so that it will last under that tension for a long time. And then, of course, we're going to put a weight on there and let that sit for 10 minutes or so before we try to handle it. And now we'll do the other edge. Exact same process. And then we'll place a weight on there. Once you've let the ends dry for just a minute or so, leave the weights in place, but now you can prepare to glue the top of the arch. So if you press it down, it should hold itself in place just from the stickiness of the vinyl. If it doesn't, just a finger to hold it in place will be fine. And once again, just place a nice amount of glue on the surfaces where the vinyl is in contact. I like to do both sides. This part here is going to be another high tension joint, so we want to make sure that that we have plenty of glue and that it's well bonded. So we'll put another weight on there and let that dry for 10 minutes or so. Now, after we've done that, we're going to go along the edges of the arch and just put a nice thin bead of glue just to make sure this tube gets bonded with there. This is not critical. This is just to keep the tube from flopping around a little bit. And we'll just put a weight on there to hold it in place so that it doesn't slide at all, and then do the same thing to the other side. Now the last piece of framing that we have to put on the main panel is the arch that goes around the oval glove ports on the front of the device. Inside of our vinyl tubing, we have two 1/8 inch fiberglass rods. This enables us to get a tighter bend radius on the corners so that we can avoid those oval hand ports. Unlike the arch on the back, this does go all the way down to the bottom, so you don't have to worry about measuring exactly from the bottom. Now, it's not going to be possible to hold that in place while we're gluing, so what we're going to do is just glue one side at a time, and we'll glue it from the bottom up to about maybe the second hole on these hand ports. Kind of glue that straight and let that cure, and then bend it and glue to the same way on the other side. So for the first one here, again, very simple. Just going to lay down a bead of glue in between these. Kind of roll them into place. And then I like to put a bead of glue on the top as well. And then a weight to let it hold in place. Now we're going to bend it for the other side. And again, we're going to glue it to about here or so. And if it starts to peel up a little bit, adding additional weights to the corners to keep that bend radius tight can be helpful. So now we're going to need to let this dry for 10 minutes before we attempt to glue the top of the arch. Because in doing that, we're going to get a pretty tight bend radius, and consequentially, we're going to have quite a lot of tension on the glue bonds here. We've let the sides sit for about 10 minutes so that they should be pretty well adhered at this point. And now we're just going to bend this middle arch down so that it kind of sits along this. Now, this is not going to want to stay in place on its own, so we're definitely going to need to use a weight here. And then we're going to kind of glue all along the edges of this to hold it in place. So I'm going to let the rest of this dry for another 10 minutes or so. And then I'll take the weight off and I'll just re-glue in the middle section and put the weight back on. Now that we've let it dry for a few minutes, we're going to finish gluing the top just to make sure that it's extra strong. Put a bead of glue along the section that was covered by the weight on both the side there as well as underneath. We're going to put that weight back on, let it set for a little bit longer, and then it should be completely finished. All that we have left to do is to attach our glove ports. So we have two sets of flanges, one that goes on the outside, one that goes on the inside. The outside should have through holes for these 1/4-20 screws. The inside is tapped. So if we grab two threaded pieces, so now one of the key ideas here is that these ring shapes overlap so that we have the bigger piece overlapping with the smaller piece so that we don't have a joint that goes all the way through the edges. It keeps it a little bit more rigid. Here you can see the completed main panel. It has 3 cross braces, 2 tubes of main framing, an arch on the front, an arch on the back, and 2 oval hand ports on the front.
Here you can see a side panel for the device where we have markings drawn for the circular hand entry points and the frame for the air filter. The circular hand entry points, their center points will be 12 inches up from the bottom of the device, and their center points will each be 7 inches from the side of this panel. You can also see the markings for the air filter housing, so that puts the back edge of the filter housing 3.5 inches from the back, and the top edge 3.5 inches from the top. The actual hole that will be cut will be 1 inch in from the edge of the filter housing. And then to actually enable installation of a new filter, the vinyl will be cut from the corner of this hole out to the hole that will be punched for the screws for the flange. Here you can see the panel for the other side of the device. The circular hand entry points are placed identically with the 7 inches from each side and the 12 inches from the bottom. You only need 1 filter on each device, so this panel does not have that.
Okay, now it's time to glue the frames for the side panels. So we're going to start with a 60-inch length of 3/16 fiberglass rod sealed inside of a vinyl tube. And on the longer dimension of the side, we're going to place the end of that tube 2.5 inches from the edge. So you can see that's right about there, 2.5 inches. Now, we are going to glue, start by just gluing the straight edge of this, and we'll glue 12 inches of length. So if we move our ruler back up, we're going to glue all the way from down here to about right here. Just the way we've been gluing everything else. We're going to put a nice bead of glue right on the edge, and then press the vinyl down with a weight. Now we want to try to get these right on the edge. And now to save some time, we're going to try to do the rest of the vinyl, or to glue the rest of the frame without having to move, or without having to wait until these cure. So we're going to have to be really careful about not stressing these joints too much as we kind of experiment with this tubing. So our next bend is going to be right here with the goal of the frame touching right at the top face, and then again touching right at the second face. So in order to position that just right, we're going to need to place some weights to hold it in place. So now at these 2 key places, our frame is in the right spot and we are ready to glue. One more weight now so that we can hold that down. And we've got about 2/3 of this glued. Now once these dry, we're going to remove this weight and we will kind of curve this back out towards that edge. Try to do the same thing on the other side. So again, remember we want the frame to touch right at the top face and then right at the second face here. Once that's in place, we're ready to glue. Okay, Now we'll wait about 10 minutes and we'll finish this off. Okay, now that we've let this cure for a little while, we should be ready to make the last glue. Once I glue this side, I'll still have to go around and glue some of these spaces on the top of the arch that I couldn't get to because of the weights initially. But for the most part, now we are ready to make the last glue line. So again, we're just going to put a nice line of glue along the edge. And once we get the tube in place, we're going to weight it down. Because this one's under tension, we may need a little extra weight compared to the other parts. Now we'll repeat the exact same process on the other side. Okay, so now that this part is nice and dry, we're going to put our little bead of glue along this inner corner. Doesn't need to be that much, just enough to kind of hold it in place. And this should be the last step to making sure these side panels are glued. Now, in the end, you don't have to do all of this in the order that I did it, but the goal is to get glue along every surface of the tube so that it's affixed along its entire length. So in whatever way actually works for you, gluing it down some way like this usually works pretty well. So the last thing we have to do to prepare the sides is attach the ring hand ports. Just like the front, obviously these are not ovals, but these are just simple circles. But we're going to attach them just the way we did the previous one. Now, another thing to note is that these frames will go on the outside of the device. So since we want our button cap screw heads to be on the outside, we need to make sure that we orient them this way. And there we have a completed side panel.
So here we have a frame built with aluminum extrusions. That is the exact dimensions of the device. So it's 27 inches tall, 24 inches deep, and 26 inches wide. We have here custom 3D printed brackets that make this the exact shape of the device, the angles and everything included. This does not necessarily have to be made out of these aluminum extrusions, but just having a frame that's the exact size of the device is useful in the final assembly of the device. So the panel has now been draped over the frame. You can see the flaps come out over the edge here. So the frame will actually be used to glue the side panels onto the main panel. These flaps will be bent down and thermoformed so that they lay flat on the frame.
So now it's time to thermoform these edges of our main panel. So it's probably possible to assemble it just like this. So if you don't have the ability to thermoform these, it's just going to be a little bit harder. You're going to probably want to flip the frame on its side and then lay weights on this when you glue it to hold it down. But we're going to use a little bit of heat to bend these flaps so that they lie flat so that we can glue the sides with it in this vertical configuration. So I've zoomed in on the top face so that you can get a really good view of the thermoforming process. So we want to make sure that it's right up to the edge, and just because of the manufacturing process being manual, most likely some of your edges will be a little bit off. So when it comes time to thermoform those edges, make sure that you readjust the frame so that it's right in the correct alignment. Now, to start, we're going to use our heat gun that we've been using, set to 640 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're just going to blast a little bit of air on the top and bottom of this piece to heat it up just a little bit, enough so that it's nice and flexible. Okay, so that wasn't enough to melt it or anything, but it's just enough to make it really easy to fold this edge right under. So this is the key part here. You're going to fold it under and make sure that crease is right even with the edge of your frame element. And now all we're going to do is run our heat gun along that edge and let it heat up, and you'll start to see it soften a little bit. And it only takes a few seconds, and then you'll be able to pull that flap out and it'll make a nice 90-degree angle. You'll notice that I applied a little bit of pressure during that process, which sometimes isn't necessary. But you can see once I flip that out, it no longer sticks out. It makes a nice 90-degree angle on the edge, and this will be a beautiful surface for us to glue the side panel to. Now, just repeat the thermoforming process for all of the other edges. I've shown you one. It's exactly the same for all of them. Okay, so we've completed the thermoforming process, and you can see we have these nice thermoformed flaps here. These will be the faces that we glue the side panels to in just a moment.
So now that we've finished thermoforming the main panel, it's time to prepare the side panel to be glued onto the main panel. So the first step is to temporarily secure the main panel to the aluminum extrusion forming frame. We do this with double-sided tape located here, 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 and here. Once the main panel is secured, then we're ready to put the side panel by using double-sided tape. Now, it's important to place the double-sided tape on as close to the inner corner as possible so as to maximize the amount of area on the panel that's being glued. It is also important to remember during this process that each of these pieces of tape will need to be removed. So put them in an area that is easy to access, but also maximizes the amount of glue that you're able to put in between the two panels. So we've zoomed in here on the top corner to illustrate the gluing process to be done for the side panel onto the main panel. As with all other gluing processes before, we're going to extrude a pretty healthy bead and then go at a fairly constant rate. And then once we have our bead, I'm just going to take the panel here, press it up against and hold it here in place just so the glue will set. All right, that's pretty good. And then you're going to repeat this process for all 4 sides.
So now it's time to remove the device from the form. So here you can see the device immediately after pulling it off of the form. We still have a couple things left to do. We need to remove the tape from the inside of the device, and we also need to install the filter and the filter port. So here you can see some of the double-sided tape that needs to be removed from the inside of the device. So for the tape that's stuck between the pieces of vinyl, using a thin rod to separate the vinyl can be very helpful. And then you can generally peel off the tape. This is a little bit of a laborious process, but it is important because removing the tape does improve the aesthetics of the device. Of course, if you are too busy and don't remove the tape, it's not going to negatively impact the function of the device. And this tape is even rated for food contact, so it's very inert. You're not going to have any problems with it kind of chemically, but it's going to be better if you can remove it if you have time. So here you can see the filter port for the device. Now in this case, there's a couple things we're going to need to do. You can see that the flap that we glued the side panel to actually overlaps with our corner hole here. So we're going to need to re-punch that hole to make sure that we can fasten between both of these. Then we're going to need to get our grate that will go inside, and then the outer filter flange will go on the outside here with the filter inside of the device, of course. So this is the filter that we're using for this application. This is a HEPA filter from Honeywell. These are typically used in air purifiers. Here you can see our filter box with the installed HEPA filter that will be placed on the exterior of the device like this. Additionally, I have the inner grate, you can see. Now this grate is actually important because it has slanted openings in it to help protect the filter from droplets. So as we place this on here, I will then be able to screw it together, and that will be the last thing that we need to do for this device to be ready. And that's it.